When you're experiencing health anxiety, it can feel like everything in your world is getting smaller. Places, people, and even everyday activities can start to feel like they're off limits because they can trigger all sorts of anxiety and fear. And so, what can you do? That's what I want to talk about in today's video, the concept of graduated exposure to build a step ladder of activity that allows you to break down your anxiety into manageable steps that can help you rebuild your confidence and help you overcome health anxiety. So, in order to understand how exposure works, it's important to understand how avoidance works. When we're anxious, our natural gut instinct is to avoid the things that make us feel anxious. And in doing so, we feel safer in the moment, safe in the short term. From a biological perspective, avoidance is often driven by a part of the brain called the amygdala. And that's the part of the brain that's responsible for processing emotions. When we feel threat or danger, the amygdala activates our fight or flight reaction. And this can lead to all sorts of physical sensations, things like accelerated heart rate, sweating, rapid breathing, muscle tension, all sorts of physical sensations that make our body temporarily stronger or faster to fight or run away from a danger or threat. But these are also physically uncomfortable sensations. So, by avoiding the feared situation, we temporarily escape these unpleasant physical sensations. The problem is that by avoiding, we don't give ourselves a chance to see that the avoided situations aren't as dangerous or threatening as we think. And over time, this avoidance can make our world smaller and smaller, and the avoidance can convince us that we're not capable of handling these feared situations. So, for example, imagine that I avoid all types of medical buildings because I'm terrified that I might catch an illness. I stop going to checkups at my doctor's office. I might avoid hospitals. I might even stay away from the pharmacy. And so, while this avoidance behavior may help me feel better in the short term, the problem is the anxiety keeps coming back, often stronger. Because now I might start worrying about all of the medical conditions or the diseases I might be missing because I'm avoiding medical care. So I might start worrying about maybe there's something here because I haven't seen my doctor in 2 years. So the idea is rather than avoiding, what we want to do is to gradually face our health anxiety fears in a step by step, gradual fashion as a way of reducing anxiety and building confidence. And this is where graduated exposure comes in. And you can think of graduated exposure like climbing a step ladder, where every rung on the step of the ladder represents a small bit of exposure that brings you a little bit closer to confronting what it is that you're afraid of. So the idea is you don't start at the very top of the ladder because that would be overwhelming. Rather, you start at the bottom of the step ladder where a little bit of exposure may feel anxiety provoking but manageable. And then you're able to slowly work your way up. So imagine I avoid any places where I think people might be sick, like doctor's offices or walk in clinics or the medicine aisle at my supermarket. But my ultimate goal is that I want to be able to make an appointment with my doctor to be able to have a checkup, which I haven't been able to do in a few years because I've been so avoidant. But just the thought of going to my doctor's appointment makes me really anxious. Sets my anxiety through the roof. And so jumping straight to that would be way too overwhelming. So what I need to break that down into more manageable steps that I'm actually capable of doing. So my first step might be simply to go into the medicine aisle at my supermarket and to stay there for a few minutes. I don't need to touch anything. I don't need to talk to anyone. I don't need to ask the pharmacist anything. I just stand there looking around and feeling whatever anxiety I'm feeling. And over time, what happens with exposure to these types of situations is that my anxiety will come down by itself without me having to do anything about it. And so what happens is I become a little more comfortable just standing in the medicine aisle. And I keep doing that until that no longer causes me a lot of anxiety. That's the first step of the ladder. And so maybe the next step of the ladder is to touch something in the medicine aisle, or maybe to talk to the pharmacist and ask for recommendations around cold or flu medicine. And once I can do that comfortably, I then move on to the next step, which may be to visit a larger pharmacy, or maybe it's to walk past a walk in clinic. Maybe it's to call my doctor's office to ask about available appointment times, etc., etc. So, there are a couple of key benefits to doing gradual exposure. And the first is that gradual exposure works by a process that we call habituation. And in habituation, what happens is that repeated exposure to the same stimulus leads to a decreased response and a decreased emotional response over time. When you repeatedly face your fears in small, manageable doses, what you're doing is you're teaching your brain that the feared situation isn't as dangerous or threatening as you thought it was. And over time, the emotional intensity associated with your anxiety and fear goes down, and that makes the exposure step easier to tolerate and then allows you to go on to the next exposure step. The other benefit of gradual exposure is that it allows you to challenge negative beliefs about the feared situations themselves. For a lot of people with health anxiety, they can experience distorted beliefs about their abilities or the potential consequences of certain actions or behaviors. And by facing these fears in this structured, graduated way, what a person is doing is collecting evidence that can help challenge or contradict these overly negative beliefs. Essentially, by doing the gradual exposure, we're collecting information about how dangerous or safe a situation is, and that's the stuff that avoidance prevents us from learning. So we know that gradual exposure works. And so the question is, how do you go about building an exposure stepladder or an exposure hierarchy? What you want to do is to start with and to start thinking about what is the ultimate situation that you want to stop avoiding. In the example we talked about earlier, maybe it's I've been avoiding having a doctor's appointment. Whatever it is, that's the top of my fear ladder. Now, the next thing to do, once you've identified the top of the ladder, is to think about all of the steps that I could take to work towards that ultimate goal. Think about things like who might be in that situation? What exactly am I doing? When am I doing it? Where will I be doing it? How long am I going to stay there? By asking these questions, what I'm able to do is to think about smaller and less intimidating or less anxiety provoking steps. The idea is to make each step feel a little bit more challenging, but not so overwhelming that it causes so much anxiety that I can't follow through and can't do it. And one way to make sure that each step is manageable is by um, ranking each step on a distress rating scale. So on a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is no distress or no anxiety at all, and 10 is extreme anxiety. And so the idea is to put a number rating on how anxious each step is, and then rank ordering the steps from least distressing or least anxiety provoking to most distressing or most anxiety provoking. So in my example, standing in the medicine aisle of the supermarket for a few minutes might start out as a 3. And as I move up the exposure hierarchy, each step gets more challenging, where walking past a walk in clinic might feel like a 4, and calling my doctor's office to inquire about an appointment, that might feel like a 6, until ultimately making an appointment to see my doctor could feel like a 10. And the key here is to repeat each step in the hierarchy over and over and over again until your anxiety at that level goes down before you move on to the next step. And the more you do this graduated exposure to these feared situations, the more you start to recognize that your anxiety doesn't last forever. It reaches a peak and then it gradually declines. And the more you do this type of exposure, the lesser the anxiety peaks and the more quickly it goes away. So it's important to recognize that this is a process that takes time. And you might feel tempted to want to rush through the exposure and the exposure ladder because you want to overcome your anxiety as quickly as possible. But it's really important to resist that temptation. You may feel like you're moving up the ladder really slowly, but the key is to make sure that your anxiety goes down before you move on to the next step. And if you have a setback when your anxiety goes up for some reason, that's okay too. Sometimes you may have to repeat this step over and over and over again, or even take a step back to build up your confidence again. And that's okay. The important thing is that you're continuing to challenge yourself and continuing to do exposures. So the idea of graduated exposure is really about taking small, manageable steps, facing your anxiety and staying in it, even when it feels uncomfortable. It would be great if exposure worked really quickly and that you could overcome your health anxiety overnight. But unfortunately, that's not how anxiety works. But with patience, practice, and commitment to this exposure process, it will have a huge impact on helping you overcome your anxiety. And if you're interested in learning more about some of the nuances of exposure therapy, I'd encourage you to check out this video. So that's all for today's video. As always, thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video, and I will see you in the next one.